He's no longer with us. We gave him to somebody who said he'll learn his lesson. They're going to put him in with some really mean roosters. It's the story of our difficult life we have during the week. But anyway, it's good to see everybody here today. And you kids, I guess you're stuck with me. Jesse's gone with his wife. They're in Mexico, I think. So hopefully they'll have a good, restful vacation. I hope our class is as good, or at least we measure up in some respects. By the way, let me inform you. Just the other day, I had some great nieces and nephews to sneak up to my house. I live way out in the woods. And they were actually daring one another because I think, were pretending like the house was haunted. So one of them on a dare went and came up into our yard. Anyway, we talked to them for a while, and I asked, "What are you doing here, kids?" And they said, "Well, back home, all the old people are talking. We don't want to be around them." I said, "Why?" "Well, they're talking old people stuff." I said, "Well, I'm old." They said, "Well, you're different." So remember that. You may not believe it, but ask my nieces and nephews. All right, so let's move on to the book of Exodus. Chapter 22, I believe we're in still, nearing the end of it. We'll be getting into 23. Laws that were given to Israel by God at Sinai. Moses, the great lawgiver. And these laws, of course, reflected principles from God for how he wants human beings to treat one another. They're very specific laws. And they have to do with a number of different cases. We face cases similar to these in our own time. Maybe not precisely the same, but they're close enough for us to figure out if that was true then for their situation, then the principle that came into play for that case would be a principle that would come into play for cases that are like it today. We'll see some of that, I guess, as we move on. So last time we pretty much were at verse 29, I think, of Exodus 22. At least we'll briefly go back and review that. I think we discussed that just a little, verse 28, actually. You shall not revile God, nor curse a ruler of your people. And I discussed how it's difficult for us today sometimes to put this into practice as we ought as people living in a democracy, because our rulers we normally think of, we take them from among ourselves. They don't inherit their right by dynasty or kingship or royalty or anything like that. At least that's not the way it's supposed to be. So we have freedom of speech, and we can justly evaluate, sometimes quite negatively, things they stand for and things they do and say. But we have to be careful not to cross that line. And it is a difficult one sometimes to distinguish by cursing a ruler. Cursing, it would be wrong. But again, we pointed out, this doesn't mean that you can't have an opinion about something, about what's going on in the government. And certainly you can. So we'll move on from that to verse 29. You shall not delay to offer from the fullness of your harvest and from the outflow of your presses. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. So what might be a principle there? God's people were expected to offer free will offerings. These offerings would be used for sacrifices and actually even sometimes to go into the treasury for the ongoing of the nation of Israel. It was a special nation. It was a nation under God in the literal sense. At this time particularly, Moses was the spokesman, but God on high was the actual king. He was the ruler. And so Moses would tell the people what God's will for them was, what his laws are, is here. And in this case, they were to be especially careful to give and show their appreciation for what they had and to give of the first of their possessions. Now, what might the principle be today? We're not a nation like that, even though this nation was founded as a Christian nation, but not literally in the same way Israel was a theocracy or rule of God. What might then be the application in the church? Now, that's not a hard one. That's easy. On the first day of the week, we are expected to, and we want to, what? Lay by and store. 1 Corinthians 16, for example, verses 1 and 2. As we have been prospered, to give generously as we've been prospered. So again, as I said already, the laws of Israel were unique to them, and yet they did ride upon, or they were founded upon, principles that are broader than the specific applications of their time. And if you can determine what the broad principles are serving as the foundation under these particular laws, you can learn a lot. And I think this is what the writer has in mind Romans 15 and verse 4, when Paul says, for whatsoever things were written aforetime, like these laws here, were written for our learning, those of us who are Christians, that we by patience and comfort of the scriptures might have hope. Now, in our studies, we shouldn't just see there are apodictic laws, which are do this and don't do that laws, but that there are in fact reasons to hope, reasons to be comforted, seeing the power of a just, righteous God who's behind this nation and who really is behind all the cosmos. So you shall do the same with your oxen, verse 30, and with your sheep 7 days it shall be with its mother. On the 8th day you shall give it to me. Verse 31, you shall be consecrated to me. There's a religious word, rarely used outside of these circles. In the everyday world, you don't normally talk about consecrating. But what does it mean? What's your idea? How do you think of it?
To set aside and make holy, special.
All right. Anybody with any other synonyms or add-ons to that? To consecrate something. What might be a synonym for the verb consecrate? Maybe dedicate. Would that be not very similar in meaning? Devote, in that sense of devoting something. Setting it aside, as you said a while ago, to use the terms you used. So you shall be consecrated. These are the people who shall be consecrated. Therefore, you shall not eat any flesh that is torn by beasts in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs. I think we might have briefly glanced at that last Lord's Day. Why might they not be allowed to eat things that are torn in the field? Meat that they find just lying around in a carcass. As I told you, it was Bear Gillis, that ridiculous showboater who claimed to be a survivor man of a sort, a British influencer he was, I think, at the time. I hadn't seen him lately. May have died of something. But he was the one telling us, oh, yeah, you can survive by eating carcasses of dead animals. Well, it was foolish because of the poison you can get. But not only that, it was contrary to the ways of Israel because God knew, well, first of all, these animals that had been lying there, probably some of them were putrid. And secondly, when they had been torn in the field, they may not have been, the blood in the bodies may not have been shed out enough. And it was a sin to eat of the blood in the Old Testament law. It was contrary to the will of God to eat the blood. So that would be another probably chief consideration for this. But you can throw it to the dogs. So dogs do not have the same value as humans. Humans live on a higher standard. You don't eat carcasses you find in the field. But a dog, yeah, let the dog have it. So it shows the proper order or chain of being in God's universe. Any questions or comments on chapter 22 of Exodus before we look at the next chapter? Okay. You shall not spread a false report. Verse 1. You shall not spread a false report. Now, let's just see what this context is. And again, I'm asking the same question that I mentioned up front in the introduction to this. Do we see any kinds of applications of this? What are the principles? Well, so let's just see. You shall not spread a false report. What does it mean by spread? Spread. Yeah, exactly. It's not literally like a blanket spread, but it means you are involved in the telling of a report. What kind of report here does he have in mind? A false report. What is a false report? It's a lie. What is a lie? When somebody makes a statement and you say that statement is a lie as compared to the truth, what is it about that statement that's different from a true statement? When somebody says, this is the case, and if he's telling a lie, then it's not the case. It's a lie is something contrary to the truth. It is that which contradicts or is contrary to the truth, of course. So here's a report. This is a story that is told about someone in particular. I think this is the context we see. And you are not, first of all, you shouldn't tell a false report. We can gather that also from this, right? You shouldn't invent it. You shouldn't be the first one to come up with a false report. Secondly, you should not spread it. Now, you mentioned a while ago, you're talking about gossip, and that carries with it in modern English. Well, it carries with the idea that there would be more than one in on this, a circle of people who are each telling the report one to the other. Someone says, I saw a quip yesterday, gossipers like to hurry up and spread their gossip before they learn that it was a lie, that it wasn't true. I don't know, that's just a quip. But the fact is they want to spread the gossip or to continue to tell that story. And in this case, it's a false report. So that's wrong. That's the first part of this verse, and I don't think we have any trouble at all seeing what he was telling Israel. Nor really do we have trouble in seeing what he would expect of us likewise. Do we? Now let's go on and read some more particulars about this principle of not spreading lies, false reports. You shall not join hands with. Now what do you think of when you think of joining hands with? What does that symbolize? If one person joins hands with another person, you teamed up with that person. In other words, maybe you don't all share the same values in every respect, but there's some common cause that you two or more, there may be several, but that you in this group have something you want to do, and you all are getting together to do this. So you're joining hands. All right. You shall not join hands with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. What might a malicious witness be? Well, when we talk about a witness, we're starting to see the particular ideas that he would have for courtroom type settings, judicial settings. Again, the principles are a lot wider than that, are they not? The respect for truth-telling that we should have. But in this case, you don't conspire with somebody, say an evil person, a wicked man. A wicked man is somebody that's not doing the will of God. In this regard, anyway, you join hands with him to spread falsehood, and it is a malicious lie, and you are becoming a malicious witness, and he is too. Now, does this ever happen in our time? This is what we decry most in our era, is that justice has been trampled in the streets, as it were. It's just true justice would be fairness. You know, our symbol for justice in this, you know what she looks like? What does our symbol for, what did it traditionally look like, the little statue? Blinded. She's blinded. And what does she have in her hands? A balance. And what does that suggest? A balance. It suggests balance. Even-handedness, as we say, that's a figure we use too. Fairness. So, all right, I see that he's someone I do not like. Therefore, I and another, a malicious witness, will join together. We're going to spread this false report. We're going to hurt him, for example, in court. We're going to take things away from him because we will make allegations about what he said, what he did or didn't do, and so on, that will make him look bad in court, and he will have to pay a fine or even worse. So it happens every day. And this is one of the reasons people say our economy is still throttled back so much, and it has little to do at this point with some recent policies enacted by the executive branch, or even some of the ridiculous decisions made by the legislative. What it has to do with more than anything is the fact we've got too many lawyers in this country. That's just the bottom line. I guess you need them sometime. I mean, if you've been falsely accused, you need someone to help you negotiate the ins and outs of the legal system. You'd want to find a good, competent, and fair lawyer, a just lawyer. But somebody says, that's oxymoron, a fair lawyer. I just looked at the other day at O.J. Simpson. You know, he passed away not long ago. He died. I'm sorry, the euphemism. He died not long ago. And we all remember being gripped, sitting on the edge of our seats watching the trial in California, in L.A., whether he killed his wife, former wife, Nicole, and her boyfriend or not. Did he do so? Well, everybody in the country thought he did, except not everybody did. Those who thought he did generally were of a certain ethnic group. Those who thought he did not, well, they didn't care if he did, or another ethnic group didn't care, and they admitted as much. Interviews took place sometime afterward of jurors who acquitted him, let him go. And they basically said this is a way for the white man to get his comeuppance, as they said, or something to that effect, words to that effect. In other words, we've been put down for so long, whether he's guilty or not, it's time to let O.J. go. He's one of us. I think some of them have had buyer's remorse since then. Some of them realized that was not right, but it was political. It was political. So we all decried that. We thought not fair. And of course, just a year or two later, in in Santa Monica, I think it was it not, where they had the next trial where the venue should have been probably to start with instead of LA, because that's where the murders were. He was found guilty of violating the civil rights of these two, had to pay a sum of money out in court, which meant that jury found him actually guilty of what he did, but technically couldn't be murdered. So we won't go into all that. We could just say that we saw a travesty at that time. In other words, politics had blatantly entered in. And it was not a matter of, many people didn't care, did he actually murder these two people or not? That was not the issue. Perhaps he did. In fact, the forensic evidence was overwhelming. We remember the silly, stupid trick with the glove and how they faked, all that sort of stuff. You have to admit, people like Johnny Cochran and Ben Shapiro and Alan Dershowitz and others on the Dream Team, the Kardashians, all this sort of thing. These were really good lawyers. And that's what we fear about them. They were so good, they got a very likely guilty man off. He wrote a book later, If I Did It. Sounds like some people who come forward and repent sometime, some of the confessions. If I've done anything wrong, I won't forget. Well, anyway, if I did it. So that says enough. That's just an epitome, as it were, of how justice has fallen in the streets in our country. Politics entered in. Many have said, and I've got on the soapbox before, I remind us that our real downfall happened when people like Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., or was it the third? I forgot his last suffix. It doesn't matter. He was a creep anyway. Ended up being in charge of our judicial system, being on the court, and his view was evolution, right down the line. He was an evolutionist. He hated Christianity. He hated common law of England because it's based on Christian principles for all those many centuries. He hated the Constitution because it was framed by a bunch of framers who were very religious people, very Christian folk. So he hated all that, and he believed might makes right. Power is all there is. And he basically said that justice is whatever you can get the judges to be persuaded to do. And that's right and wrong. A very crass, very pragmatic view. And this has been the dominant feature of our legal system. Now, there have been exceptions. There are still Christian people in the halls of justice, some who have these older traditional ideas of right and wrong, and laws should be based upon that, and determinations of guilt and innocence should be based upon the truth and not tricks, lawyers' tricks. And of course, if we were to even start talking about politics today, we know it's not a matter of how many vote for one candidate, how many vote for another. That's not the issue anymore. It's who can put the other one in jail quicker than, or hurt him in so much. So we know there is very little justice. But God was aware of how people would do that sort of thing. Much to be said about this by way of, broad application of these things. Verse 1, you should not join hands with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. And then verse 2, this may be similar, but it's a little wider. Now let's think about this. You shall not fall in with the many to do evil. Now, think about the many who are out to do evil. What might you call that group today in our society? A group of many who are out to do evil. Gangs. There's one very good description. What kind of, are there other, well, these are like criminal gangs. Say drug dealers. Mobs, gangs, mob. Now, what's the definition of a mob? If your children say, Daddy, what's a mob? And you say, what's that thing on the end of a stick where you kill in the floor? No, you'd say a mob is what?
A group of people trying to influence.
All right. What's wrong with more than one individual wanting to influence? Say, we're a group. Are we right now a mob? Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. I thought it was. I didn't want to step on here. No, a mob is generally motivated by emotions. They're not rational, and they generally like to cause trouble. Physically.
When we all hear the expression mob mentality. What does that mean in your mind? What would be a mob? Why is there a certain mentality that might be different in a mob from an individual?
The individuals no longer take responsibility for themselves, but they just follow a group, and it's all together like a herd almost.
Yeah, I heard the quip, I read it years ago, this is back in the 70s or 80s. If you ever get lost somewhere in the Middle East, just pick up a rock and follow the nearest mob, and you can find the U.S. Embassy. Now, I mean, we think about that, we laugh. That's the way it has been, and because of we think of. I use the term mindlessness, but not literally. They have a mind. Now, the mob mind is the sum greater than its parts? Can a sum ever be greater than its parts? When I'm not thinking about mathematics on paper, I'm talking about in the real world of human beings. Can a sum be greater than its parts? And I answer resoundingly, yes. A sum is greater than its parts. How can that be? You have individuals who, as individuals, might be sort of sober-minded, might think correctly. But you get a group, let's just say a bunch of protesters on a college campus today. Now, most of them have been instigated by big money and political agendas, billionaires behind the scenes, mostly Marxists, who are using this as an excuse to stir up more trouble against the United States and to cause problems before the election, too, obviously. So it's not so much the Palestinian cause they are concerned, just whatever happens to be the cause of the day, they take it up. So they join together as a mob. And many have been interviewed separately. They've separated some of these kids from the mob, and they've asked them, why are you here? What do you think what does the expression from the river to the sea mean to you? What does it mean to you? I don't know, it has something to do with Palestine? I don't know. What does it mean? What is the expression from the river to the sea? What river? What sea? By the way, we're going to get into that in this study if we go that far today. We'll see that. So I may just save that. But in other words, they don't know what they're talking about. But hey, my friend said after school today, when you get through with this class, we're going to go all the way meet out in the quad, and then we're going to gather together, and you can put on these armbands or whatever, and we'll go out, and I'll give you some posters, and we're going to go protest. Protest what? The plight of the poor Palestinians. What's wrong with the Palestinians? They're being put down by the man, or however that's. Okay, whatever that means. So it's a mob. Yes. The mob mentality is a sum greater than its parts. It's like a collective mind. In their sober-mindedness as individuals, they wouldn't act that way. But when they get together, they act up. I do believe that. I don't know if anybody in this room agrees with me, but I think there is such a thing as the mob mentality. So we don't want to ever get caught up in something like that, not even for a conservative cause. Now, does that mean any protest, public display of one's political convictions or ideals is necessarily a mob? No. Usually the conservatives, the traditionalists, they don't form mobs. They're just large groups of people. The sum is equal to its parts. It's a large group of people. But with a mob, it's different.
So you say the people, what creates that one person to go bad?
Yeah.
Like, example, years ago, I had a guy working for me that was part of a white supremacy group. He didn't act that way in private, but when he got around them, it was like the difference in daylight.
Good example. In fact, I don't know this guy, but I've known of people like that. That's a good example there, that case in point, where to treat, they wouldn't individually mistreat people of another race, but when they get together and they burn a cross or whatever, have their parties or whatever, get drunk, and they would act differently and say things they wouldn't do normally. A lot of people are like that. So I would call that the mob mentality. It's a good illustration of it. Yeah, it doesn't have to be a physical mob. Can there be a mob online?
Yes, and there can be a mob in the classroom or in the school grounds, or there can be one in the workplace, or even in your family sometimes. Not like a mob, but like he's talking about, they wouldn't do it unless they're with their friends or with this particular group of people.
We talk about the mobs. I have to be careful. I don't want to in any way saddle a certain ethnic group like Italians with that problem. Because the truth is, my folks are a bunch of mix, most of them, McGookin. So they're all Irish. So you got the Irish mob too. And then there are Jewish mobs and there are Russian mobs, Ukrainian mobs. They're just, every group seems to form, has the tendency to form mobs. But you mentioned, could be in a classroom. That's probably a physical mob. But what if it's an online, what if it's a group of people? I think much of the mob mentality today exists in cyberspace, as we used to say in the 90s. I know that's an old word, but anyway, it exists out there. It's in the digital realm. But we're all influenced by it. Everybody says this, everybody believes that. So I'm going to say it because if I go against it, let's see what it means to go against. We're going to see here that he talks about the need to go against the mob. Yeah.
Can I throw a verse up here?
Yes. All right, so you put this up from the New Testament. Why would you think of this verse in terms of the mob situation we're studying here?
To his point, he was talking about this, worker that would get around those other folks that he would act differently. This is kind of the point.
This is, would it only be a mob, though, that runs good morals, a company of a lot of people, or could one individual run? Yeah, but it certainly works either way, right? Whether it's one or several, works either way. Thank you. And that's what influences us negatively. Evil communication, evil companions corrupt good morals. 1 Corinthians 15:33. Thank you, Chris. All right, so verse 2, you shall not fall in with the many to do evil, nor shall you bear witness in a lawsuit siding with the many so as to pervert justice. So here we have a situation where in this case, there's a lawsuit. We are talking about a courtroom setting. And there's a large group, more than one anyway, there's a group. And they have decided they're going to create an injustice. They're going to persuade the judge and the jurors to do something against somebody. And it's unjust. In other words, the person they're going against is a real victim, being victimized, innocent with respect to what they're charging. So you don't follow that. Don't get in on that sort of thing. Don't fall in with the many so as to pervert justice. All right, let's just, you really can't take a few minutes in a Bible study in a class like this one. Is as good as this setting is to talk about what is justice. Alasdair MacIntyre wrote a book, a famous book, Whose Truth, Whose Justice? That was the title. Whose truth, whose justice? We always say, speak the truth. And we should always love justice. And he asked, whose truth, whose justice? And I've read the book, I've got it at home. He had some interesting things to say, but he didn't actually come up with the explanation. I mentioned Alan Dershowitz a while ago. I mean, everybody knows he's a famous lawyer. He's kind of an enigma. Sometimes he makes you really angry because he's a Democrat and he comes up with really strange ideas. In the past, he defended Bill Clinton too, and from some of his shenanigans. But at the same time, today, he's fair. In other words, he wants to take the Constitution sometimes and he will see what's happening now, and he'll say, that's not constitutional. So you have to give him his due. He's a brilliant man, but I think he wrote in a law journal sometime in the past on the subject of justice, because that's what lawyers sometimes talk about. And he tried to define justice. And so, you talk about all the views, is it just might makes right, Holmes' ideas. Well, how do you define justice? That is a really legitimate question. It's very important. It's not something to laugh at. How do you define justice? What makes a law just? Is there something bigger than the law itself or the group of people? Let's think about what happened in Hitler at Germany in the 1930s. When he was voted into power and became Chancellor of Germany, then he began to take away their freedoms very quickly. They were silly enough to vote him in so that he could take away the vote. That happens. Anyway, he took over and became more and more dictatorial in his party, the Nazi Party, over Germany. And while Hitler ran it, they ended up with some strange notion that all their ills pretty much go back to the Jews. There's an ethnic group that we've got to get rid of because they're causing all the troubles we've ever had. Germany's always been kept down. We lost the first war and so on, all because Jewish bankers didn't finance it. Crazy, twisted stuff in his mind. He was not alone. He got a lot of that from Margaret Sanger and people like that. Some of his ideas, not necessarily the Jewish question, but that some lives are more valuable than others from American intellectuals. So it's a shame to think he was influenced by them, the left in our country. And he was left, by the way, Nazism is not right wing. That's ridiculous. Nobody knows his history who actually seriously calls Nazis right wingers or fascism right wing. It isn't in any sense. It's far to the left in every proper use of the term, socially and politically. It's far to the left. So, and you would say, well, what about Marx? So was it. It's just two scorpions in a bottle. Two leftists were fighting each other, Stalin and Hitler, for example. But anyway, what was just? In the Nuremberg trials that happened a year or so after the closing of the conflict, the the United States, Great Britain, and France, the representatives of the Allied powers, the victorious Allied powers, put Nazi leaders on trial as war criminals. They put them on trial, and they had to defend themselves, to defend their own lives, their freedom and their lives. In many cases, they were executed for war crimes. The Nazis were allowed a defense because we made it as fair a court as we could. The Nazis were allowed to have their own defense. And they had some brilliant lawyers who made very persuasive sounding defenses by saying, these men here were just lieutenants, as it were, following orders from above. You can't fault them with the concentration camps. They didn't invent them. They just were following orders. And a good soldier always follows orders. If you had a society where every soldier would question his orders, it'd be chaos. There would be no army. If it's just, an army of one, that's stupidity. That's American stupidity to get people to sign up who don't know any better. There is no army of one. It's an army. And so it has to think is almost like a mob mentality with the top brass over it all. So they made that point pretty persuasively. We had to follow orders. Within the prosecution, our side, the Allies would say, but you knew you were killing innocent people. Well, yes, but I didn't agree with the law personally, but I had to follow it. I didn't have a choice. That was one of their arguments. But then that was broken in court by the fact that there was an appeal to a principle that we've often heard. What is it? We ought to obey God rather than men. So there comes a time, even in an army, where if the orders are immoral and wrong, you can't make the excuse, I'm just following orders. You should be willing, if necessary, to go to the brink, be punished because you will not do that, which is wrong. Now, this doesn't mean you have the right to question everything that you don't, but there are certain things that are black and white, and that was one of them, the concentration camp. When it came to evil, black and white, they could see it. Everybody, all the world could see it. That was the first argument. The second argument they made was we had laws on the books. What is justice? They asked that question. And the laws were indeed on the books, put there by the Nazis. And Nazi judges were interpreting those laws according to Nazi philosophy. That Jewish people, for example, and others were considered undesirable and not as valuable as the German people. And they were troublemakers, they alleged. So we have every right to get them out of our midst because they're causing trouble. And this is our final solution to that problem. So they argued this was our law, our justice. And then they said there's a rule of law, that which is against ex post facto laws. After the fact, you cannot come in and impose an alien law after the fact on an event that happened. Like today, somebody does something that's perfectly innocent. And then tomorrow they come along and make a law that makes what you did today illegal, although people try to do that. But they argued you can't do this. So they said, you won the war. France, you won the war. Britain and America, you won the war. But you cannot put us in jail or kill us and have us to experience capital punishment because we were following orders and we were following our laws. Is that persuasive to y'all? I mean, that was their case. I've read some of the transcripts. It was interesting how we have the English translation of these Nazis lawyers. Some of them, I think, spoke English as well. Well, how was that broken in court where they ended up executing many of these who used such defenses? Justice Jackson for the United States had said there is a higher law. Remember, we discussed that when we talked about the war and flu debate. He says there is a higher law. Instead of just the law of Germany at the time or the law of the United States or France, there's a higher law that transcends the provincial, that is what's in Germany, and the transient, that is what was in place in the 30s and early 40s. There's a higher law. He didn't really articulate that. That was a quotable quip, but the French prosecutor did, and I forgot his name, but he was brilliant. He actually said that higher law is a moral law. It's a moral law for all nations. And the French prosecutor finally said, and it's based on Christian ideals. So that's how the Nazis were executed, some of them put on trial. That was the concept of justice in the Nuremberg court. Suppose Nuremberg were be conducted today, many doubt it would ever happen after a conflict like that. But suppose there were to be such a trial. There were some after the Kosovo conflict, there were some war criminals there in The Hague who were prosecuted, but the prosecution was very wimpy compared to the 1940s. Rigorous prosecution of the French, for example, based on the moral law that comes from God, the Creator. So it's very doubtful that would happen today. But that goes right back to the question, what is justice? What makes a law right or wrong? Says who? And this was what the Nazis were defending themselves by, that question. Who were you? And they'd say, oh, we know you won the war. You got lucky, they thought. You won the war. But because you now have the guns pointed at us and we're in chains, we're in shackles, does that make you right? And they argued, just because you got the muscle right now doesn't make you right any more than you say, we weren't right just because we once had the muscle in Germany. A question that has to be asked and has to be answered. And of course, the Jews, the Israelite nation had an answer. It was very obvious what justice was for them. What is justice? Justice, not justice. Justice is a political term today that means people who are aggrieved because of past history they imagine occurred and they want to get special treatment today, especially in politics. That's justice. I'm asking, what is justice? Okay, I guess everybody know, we know the answer. How would you frame if some Martian came down and got out of spaceships? What is justice? I do not know this word. What would you say?
It's abiding by
The law of God. You couldn't say it any more succinctly than that. And you couldn't leave any of those elements out. Abiding by, following the law of whom? God. There can be no justice apart from God. That's why MacIntyre asked that in his book. Whose truth, whose justice? In a post-Christian world, these questions are very difficult to answer. Dershowitz could not answer. By the way, in the article I mentioned, he could not provide a final answer. I don't know how to define justice. They would say basically, I know it when I see it, but I can't define it. But Christians can and must define it. In fact, all God followers, as in this case. Now, that's all in verse 2, by the way. All that I said that we talked about. These are implied. You do not need to pervert justice. Verse 3, nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his lawsuit. Now, wait a minute. That seems counterintuitive to Americans, doesn't it? He's poor. And he's got a lawsuit. Let's just say he's making an allegation against a rich guy, or maybe a bunch of rich men brought him to trial. And he's making this case that they've mistreated me. I'm a victim. Now, the judges should be sobbing, right? And shedding tears, saying, oh, it's so sad. I'm so sorry they treated that way. You guys are going to get it. What's Moses saying? You must not do that. Yeah, but he's poor. He's been mistreated all of his life. You might say, just extend it. He doesn't have power like they do. So isn't it our job to try to tip the scales of equity in his favor, since he's poor and they've got plenty? They can be sued. They'll have to give up to him a lot of money and he'll be better off. And they're not going to hurt too much. They've got plenty of money anyway. Is that what he's saying you should do? No, he knew that would be a tendency. Why would human beings do that? Well, for one thing, we're sympathetic, right? I guess for another thing, we'd think if I were in his place, it'd be nice if I could get the money. I don't know. Chris, do you have a comment?
This just goes towards bias. Just saying you should not show any kind of bias, whether it be.
But isn't it bad? If you're going to show bias, shouldn't you show it to poor, oppressed people?
No, you shouldn't show bias. I mean, that's the point. Not for rich, not for poor. Your justice is blind, as we like to say, as we used to believe, as we used to actually.
And that's what that expression means. Justice is blind. It means I'm not going to consider the fact you're poor, you've had it tough in life, he's always had a good life, and you accused him of something. If he did it, if the facts show that he did it and he broke the law, then justice would demand he be punished, a fine or whatever. If he didn't do it, no matter how much you don't like your lot in life and you wish you had some of his money, you shouldn't get some of it if he's not guilty.
It reminds me back in, I guess it was the 90s, where there are all these popular shows, all of these, Maury Povich and that kind of thing, where they bring people on and they have their sob stories about how seems like we're seeing that now morph into the actual legal system where there's always an excuse, there's always some extenuating circumstance that lets people off the hook, whether it be that, well, I'm, of a certain ethnic background, or I'm poor, or I'm et cetera, et cetera. There's always an excuse. And we actually let that go now. We actually use that in the formulation of justice, and that's the problem now, is we're not.
And this is this right here is an illustration of that tendency to allow some circumstances, for example, he's poor, to pervert our sense of what's right and wrong. What's the law? The law is the law, regardless of who it is. And by the way, you don't have to comment on this much. It's pretty obvious. When Christianity was subverted back in you say the Renaissance, and it ended up in the French Revolution, the first salvo in the war of socialism against the West, but particularly under Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and their thoughts, communism is a system based squarely upon this very precept, turning this precept upside down. It ostensibly claims to be for the poor, the proletariat, the worker. Actually, it is for the party. We all know that. It's always for the party, but they get leverage and power because people will give it up in the name of justice or whatever they call it. They'll give it up, say, I'll give up my individual freedom if you can take this money from all these rich people and give, or they'll be equally as poor as I am, however you want to put it. So Marxism is built on the opposite of this because it's not Christian, and it's not Judeo-Christian either. It's not Jewish. Why were the Jews hate? Why is Jewish thought hated? I don't mean necessarily people today, secularist Jews in our country. I'm talking about why has Judaism been hated so much over the years? Well, for the same reason Christianity is hated when it comes to laws like this. And the atheistic point of view does not bear to live by these kinds of laws. Verse 4. Y'all remember this now, kids. It may happen one day this week. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall bring it back to him. What's the application? You know a kid who lives down the street, and you're walking along and you see his bicycle. Where's he? I don't know, but somehow the bicycle got here, and if it stays there, somebody pick it up in the back of a truck and take off with it. It'll be gone, right? Is that an application? Or what's an application for us who are adults? I mean, your neighbor's donkey wanders into your yard. What do you do? Ooh, I have a donkey. I'm going to put him away. I've got a new donkey. No, you know it's your neighbor's donkey. And that beast of burden would be needed for him to survive. Go ahead.
If you run across a wallet or a purse, and you know whose it is, especially, you give it back to them. Somebody dropped it.
That's how you test who is an honest man, right? Betty got that one, I think. Well, I watch a lot of Three Stooges, see. And there's a lot of philosophy you can learn from the Three Stooges short. They're determining who's an honest man, so they do the wallet trick. They put a wallet with a dollar bill out on the sidewalk and tie a string to it. And whoever's the honest man who comes and takes it, they'll rip it. If he puts it in his pocket, they'll rip him and take his clothes off with it. Anyway, that is the test for such things. Now, if it's your neighbor's chicken, I had a chicken wander up in my yard one time. I didn't keep her. The hen stayed around all afternoon, but I suspected she had come from my neighbor who lived through the woods, from his house, and she disappeared. I guess she went right back to his house. I probably did wrong. I had not read this recently. I probably should have picked up the hen and taken it to him, but I think she went back. Anyway, can y'all think of any other applications of this principle today? If your enemies, now wait a minute. I said neighbor, didn't I? What does this say? If you meet your enemy's ox, no, that's different, right? If he's your enemy or she's your enemy, then you don't have to follow this rule, right? What he says, enemies. I think he's making that very point. Even if it's your enemy's ox or donkey, do the right thing, do the decent thing. Be kind even to your enemy. And sometimes we have enemies like that. People we don't get along with as well as we would like. There's been friction for some reason. You still do an act of kindness. If you see the donkey of one who hates you, lying down under its burden. So what's the picture here? Donkeys were beasts of burden, so you can see maybe a bunch of boxes with heavy vegetables in it. It's all tied with ropes around him. The donkey has wandered off, and it just can't take the weight anymore. It's just under the weight. What's it going to do to that donkey to sit there under that weight a long time? Probably ruin it. Mess up his muscles where he's not going to be able to carry weight in the future. So what should you do if you find that donkey but it belongs to somebody who hates you? What are you supposed to do? You shall refrain from leaving him with it, leaving the donkey with the burden. What shall you do? You shall rescue it with him. The idea is lift that, cut the cords, take the boxes off the poor donkey, get him up, take care of the donkey. And of course, we already saw the earlier principle. If he's wandered astray from your enemy even, you're to take him back, right? You're to return the donkey. 6, you should not pervert the justice due to your poor in his lawsuit. So this is just the opposite. Rich people and oligarchy shouldn't be in control and get all the say over other people who don't have the money. In lawsuits, for example, don't put them down in lawsuits and pervert justice. He can't hire a lawyer as you can, a real top-notch one. Keep far from a false charge and do not kill the innocent and righteous, for I will not acquit the wicked, and you shall take no bribe. For a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of those who are in the right. Do you think anybody ever disagreed with that and thought, no, I could take the gift that's given to me out of appreciation for my act as say a judge or a lawmaker or whatever, and money comes to me, they just appreciate the fact that I sometimes consider their causes. So I think that I can be perfectly fair even though they give me money and others have not given me money or as much. So what if I or my family took a lot of money from Ukraine or Romania, Red China, and I took that money in just because people appreciated the fact that I pat them on the back when I visited with them. We had some good business discussions and so on. I mean, just because of that, that doesn't mean that I would pervert justice. That doesn't mean that I would be lenient toward Red China, for example, in a conflict, or even in a trade war. Does it mean that? Come in, my brother. Now, somebody says, you got to be careful not to talk about politics. How can you discuss these principles of the Old Testament without making application to things that happen around us? These principles apply to their leaders and judges. They apply to our leaders and judges. You cannot make a radical distinction between moral principles having to do with an individual and moral principles having to do with groups of individuals, including entire governments. So, yeah, he says here, you shall not pervert justice due to the poor in his lawsuit. Verse 7, keep far from a false charge and do not kill the innocent. Okay, we already saw verse 8. Don't take bribes. Yeah.
Look, if you don't mind, I'd like to go back to verse 5, the donkey.
Okay.
So, you think the thrust of that verse is the fact that you don't take out, the fact that you don't like your enemy on something that is associated with the enemy. An animal. Now, an animal's one thing. If you saw that something was happening to your neighbor or your enemy's property, you say, oh, that's going to ruin. If I let that stay like that.
Give me an example.
I don't know. You see that something is spilled on your neighbor's car.
Okay.
Or your enemy's car.
Yeah, your neighbor's enemy in this case.
Your enemy neighbor. Do you let that? That's going to ruin. I'm glad to see that's going to ruin.
Well, would people not? Aren't there people who would say?
Well, there are, but my question is, verse 5 says, if you see the donkey of one invades you lying under its burden, you should refrain leaving him with it. You shall rescue with it. So, is it more, you think, the case that you don't take out the fact that you don't like this person on the poor donkey of the man, right? Or is it that just because he's your enemy, you shouldn't let anything happen to anything that is his property? What do you think is more? What do you think is both, or either?
Oh, are you asking if the concern is more for the donkey?
The donkey, which he's just an innocent, he's just associated with.
Well, in in view of the other verses we have been looking at about justice needing to be blind, being fair, whether he's poor or rich, considering the facts, not the persons involved. Come right in. I would say it's not so much for the animal, although there is concern for animals in the law. That might be a part of it. But suppose it were not a donkey, but as you said, an inanimate object like a car or something in modern speech. What do you think the principle is? A lot of people would say, I don't like her anyway. This is going to be so fun. I can't wait to see her face when she realizes that stuff was left on her car, and by tomorrow morning it'll be absolutely ruined. The paint job will be ruined. I could get it off now, but I won't. I could do it, but I'm not going to do it. I don't like her. What would the law of Moses say about that? I think it would be the same as in the case of the donkey. Even though it's now, what does Jesus say? Does he come up with a radically new ethic? Not really. In the Sermon on the Mount, if you see your enemy hungry, see, has to do with the enemy himself. What are you supposed to do if he's naked and destitute? What are you supposed to do to your enemy? Feed him and clothe him. But wait a minute, that's my enemy. If I help him prosper, he'll just live to fight me another day, right? What does Jesus say anyway? Maybe not. Suppose you show that act of kindness. Suppose you come up walking in, you got a donkey and you got your own donkey. Now you have two donkeys. Let's just imagine you got your two donkeys and you divided this heavy load up that was on this neighbor's donkey. And you come bring in that neighbor's donkey and you fed him and watered him. And your neighbor says, what are you doing here? I found your donkey under the burden. Maybe it wandered off. And you bring it to your neighbor. I just thought you might want it back. What will your neighbor probably think? Well, most people, if they have any gumption, as my mother used to say at all, would say, thank you, I appreciate that, and would instead of wanting to start a fight with you because he's your enemy or she's your enemy, would want to say, well, I appreciate that. And in fact, before he could say something bad, he thinks, wait a minute, that person just did a real act of kindness for me. I'd feel that low if I said something bad now. I feel like there are coals of fire on my head. In fact, that's to pour coals of fire on his head, is it not? That's not a bad thing. It's just a way of showing, it's to burn out the pride, you might say, that's causing the conflict to start with, so that the barriers will begin to disappear. This is the way of the peacemaker, even for your enemy. What about enemies outside of Israel? Yes, I think it would be applicable even in cases like that. All right, well, we got to stop here, haven't we? We talked about bribes. Next time we'll look at verse 9 about foreigners. Don't mistreat foreigners. Doesn't mean you can't close your borders, but it means don't mistreat people just because they're foreigners in your midst. Okay, thank you all. Appreciate your attention.